Hi, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays with Troy. As always, I'm Troy Lambert. I'm an author, I'm an editor, I'm a mystery writer, and I'm the education lead for Plottr. And today I'm your host. And today we're going to talk about something that I get asked about a lot, and I'm going to give you a glimpse inside the process of creating a story arc for a series. I'm going to show you two different ways to do that with two very different series that I'm working on. So I hope that proves helpful to you in developing your own. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some background on the first series we're going to look at. Last year, I engaged in this challenge to write 52 short stories in a year, one a week, every week for a year. Well, because of who I am, I wrote all of those stories in essentially the same world, but I didn't write them necessarily in the order you would a novel or a regular story. So now I've decided to novelize those short stories. But to do that, I needed to develop an overall story arc. Well, since each one of those was 2,000 words long, I figured out this is really about three novels. This is about a trilogy worth of material that I have here, but I have to do something with it, right? So instead of starting with the stories and trying to figure things out that way, and even instead of trying to start with individual books, I wanted to start with the overall story that I was looking at. So I looked at a series timeline first before I even started outlining the books. Now, this may be unusual. This may not be the way that you do things. You may have written a couple books and then you're looking at the overall series timeline. I think the principle will be the same. So first of all, let's get started. I'll show you in Plottr where you find this series timeline, where you can set it up, and how exactly you can make this work for you. So let's get started. So my series was called the Solitaire Series. It was all based on a deck of cards because a simple way to write 52 short stories is to draw a playing card every single week and to write a story based on that card. That was my writing prompt for stories every single week. This did make things challenging. So I named it the Solitaire Series. The first couple of covers you see here were actually for the short stories that are in the series. Those are going to change, but those two turned out to be names of the first two books in the series. The third one is going to be called The Ace of Spades. So you can see I've set up all my books here. And in fact, under the first book, I've started to create a timeline. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit too, and exactly what that looks like. But for now, what I'm going to do is go to this drop down menu up in the top. And instead of staying on this individual book, I'm going to look at the Solitaire Series view. Now in here, I have created a timeline. Now, what I've done with this timeline is I actually started with a template. So this template, this hero's journey template, is actually going to cover 3 different books. And I have put those books in timelines down below. So book 1 is the Jack of Spades, book 2, the Queen of Hearts, book 3, the Ace of Spades. You get the idea. So essentially what I've done though is I've broken this trilogy into 3 acts. The trilogy itself will have 3 acts that are all part of an overall hero's journey, and then each book will have its own timeline. So essentially what happens in book 1 is what would happen normally in act 1 of a book. So when we come to the end of the hero's journey, before we break into 2, we're going to move into the next book. Now you can see when I move into the next book, I have an overlap here. This is the hook that drags the reader from this book to this one. This is the book that's going to drag the reader from the hook that's going to drag the reader from one to the other. We're going to hint at this hook at the end of book 1. We're going to fulfill that hook almost immediately in book 2 before we move into the next story. So the beginning of book 2 is going to be the ordinary world as it was at the end of book number 1. So you could read that book as a standalone because there's enough of the ordinary world there that a reader new to the series could come in, see that, like it, move forward, right? But it would be helpful for them, and you make it clear that it would be helpful for them to read the first book as well. And this is how you get people to engage in your series overall. Okay, so let's look in a little more detail at what we've done here. So essentially, in the hero's journey, we have the ordinary world, right? Now, in this particular case, I'm going to introduce the ordinary world in book one, the beginning of book one, that is the foundation for the ordinary world in the whole rest of the series. So it's super critical that I get it right. So I have made myself some notes here, and this is early in my process as I've made some notes that say, we need to learn about Solitaire, the front, then we need to learn about Solitaire, what's actually happening behind it. And there's some key things that we need to look here. And I'm already planting a mysterious deck of cards here that is going to come into play at the end of book one. So I'm already thinking about the whole series as I'm planning this out. This is going to actually be easier for you if you've already written book one. You already know what happens. You already have a structure, and you already know how to bring this in so that the reader will see and understand it, okay? Because you've already written it, okay? In this case, I've written short stories, but I haven't written the whole thing. So I need to decide what order those stories are going to be and what the plot is that's going to tie all this together, okay? So I'm going to look at that ordinary world. I'm going to look at the call to adventure. And I know that these three things are going to happen in the first book because they all happen in the short stories. Now I have to put them in the order that I want them to be in. So I know these three things happen. You notice I'm not going into super detail here. Where I'm going to go into detail is in the individual timelines for the book. In this particular case, what I'm essentially going to be looking at is these three keys and the fact that Jack's life is threatened. That's going to help me actually build the Plottr file for each individual book because I'm going to have something to hang things on. And I'll show you what that's going to look like in a minute too. Okay. And so this is, you notice it's Act 1 and Act 1B of this particular book. This is still in Act 1 of the overall series arc. Jack is forced into hiding. That's his refusal of the call. He gathers a team of potential allies. That's the meeting the mentor, what we'd call meeting the mentor in the hero's journey. Okay. And then we have Jack's surgery. So Jack has been maimed by these people that tried to kill him, basically. And he comes to a point where he has a surgery that not only can heal his body, but it can change his appearance, which is going to give him a distinct advantage going into book 2. Okay. So this is the crossing the threshold moment for the overall series, but it's the end of book 1. Him going into surgery and then emerging from it is going to be the hook into book 2, but it's also going to be the resolution of the story in book 1. So essentially, all book 1 is doing is introducing us to the world and giving us this story that really sets Jack on this overall journey. But we have to divide that up so we keep it satisfying in and of itself. So I put here Act 2A, Act 2B, Act 3, right? And then as I break into 2 in the overall series arc is actually Act 1 of the second book, which works out beautifully because this test allies and enemies gives me immediate action in my story. The battle begins almost as soon as the person opens the book. They get to see Jack emerging from his surgery as an entirely new man. If this is a new book to them, they see a guy that's just come out of something and been totally transformed into a different person. And now he has the advantage of stealth, which he clearly did not have in book 1. And that's one of the clear themes throughout all of those stories. He clearly didn't have that in book 1. Now he has it in book 2. And now we have this battle that happens in book 2. He discovers the route to the hidden treasure. That's the approach to the innermost cave. And then the Queen's men intercept him. That's the ordeal that happens there. And the reward just before we break into 3 is that Jack breaks this critical code that's a part of the story, right? Then in our overall series, we break into three by breaking into the next book or the third book. Okay, so the queen discovers the false clue that Jack has left for her. They race towards the final clue because they know where they're going. They encounter a bunch of battles along the way because, of course, the queen figures out where they're going and what they're doing. And in the end, Jack finds the final card and the final thing he's been looking for, which is the Ace of Spades, that helps him understand this overall story. And it does the same thing for the reader. Everything wraps up in that final one. Now you'll see that in this one, obviously I have much less detail. Typically, Act 3 is much shorter than the second act. Okay, I've got a lot of stuff that I put in the background in book 1 that I need to cover in Act 1, even though Act 1 is usually relatively short as well. Usually, Act 2 is about 50% of any given book, right? But instead, I'm going to tighten that Act 2 so it's about 33%. So each of these is about a third of the overall story. So I'm going to make them all equal out. And book 3 is going to be extremely fast paced, extremely tense, and it's going to lead to the climax of the series. And that way I've got everything all together, right? Okay. So what does this mean to you? Well, this is one example of how to use an act structure overall to structure a trilogy. Well, what if you have a whole bunch of books? And you'll also see, before I move on to that, you'll also see that in this, I've added some potential reader magnets. Now, if you're an author who has an email list and stuff like that, you realize that things are changing in the email world. And one of the things is to offer some frequent incentives for people that are a part of your email list to continue to follow you. And so this is one way to do that, is to have some potential reader magnets, some potential character backstories. And I've already built this into my series view model. Okay, I've already built that in. Now, what this helps me do is, and it may help you, let's say you've only written the first book and you're moving on to the second book or something like that. What it helps me do is it helps me when I go down and look at the individual book, you'll notice that on the main timeline are some of the exact same things that I had underneath that general timeline for the whole series, and I've separated them out to be in different parts of the book. I know that Jack's surgery is right here in this area in beat 11. Okay, so if we zoom in on that, we can see that I've taken these things. I needed to learn about the Ace of Spades, the maps and stashes, and the solitaire code. So I'm going to show the reader these things. I'm going to show them through action in these first few chapters to show them what this book is and this whole series is really all about. Then he's going to defeat the assassins when he's meeting the mentor. I already have a story in mind that I know was one of the stories that I wrote that's going to fit in here. It's going to fit in here beautifully, and it's going to answer those questions right there about defeating the assassins. I also have stories written for this, so I'm going to add those in, the stories that I've already written with the summary. Okay, that may not apply to you. But then you notice I filled in almost everything with this first plot. I filled it almost all in. Okay, so I've added in those elements that I had in that overall series timeline, and I've added them in here. Now, because I'm probably the closest on this book to actually having something pretty solid for the outline, then when you look at the second book, you'll see that it's a little more sparse. I've only just added the things that I know are going to happen and approximately where I think they're going to happen. Okay. And I'm going to add the stories in here on that third line as I go through here to determine where I'm going to put those stories and what blanks I have to fill in between them. But I know that the final elixir here in book 2 is that Jack breaks the code, because that's what's going to lead him on to his final journey. So this book is going to be all about him setting him up to break that code for that final thing. And same thing with the Ace of Spades. You'll see that I only had a few things in that third act, and that's really all that I have on this timeline at the moment. Okay, so if we zoom out and look at that, I've only really got these same three things that I had in Act 3, because this may change a lot by the time I get through book 2. But I've still got a pretty solid direction of where I'm going. And I pretty much know that just before the final climax, Jack is going to find the Ace of Spades. Then these last few beats are going to be about him finding the answers that resolve everything that's happened so far in this series. Okay, so this is if you have a trilogy, right? And you have a pretty standard hero's journey outline, and it all looks pretty good. And then you say, oh, well, actually, I have a series that's a lot longer than that. I have a series that's 12 or 15 books or 20 books. How do I create a story arc for that? Now I'm going to show you one way to do that as well. And it's a little bit different, but you can apply this in almost any way. You could cover two beats with your um you could cover two beats with your with each book, or you could do even more than that. So here we're going to take a look at this one. This one is my Meet Cute series. Okay, if you're not familiar with this, I've shown this a couple of times on demonstrations, and basically I've made up this crazy series where serial killers fall in love, right? So it's a romantic comedy only with serial killers in it. There's a whole bunch of books in this. Now, I haven't planned all of these books out. Okay, so I haven't even mapped them all out yet, but I'm going to show them to you anyway, because I'm going to show you what you could do. Okay, perhaps the thing that ties this series together, because I want them to each be different standalone serial killers couples that fall in love. So I don't want the same couple through all of these different books. So I've created again the hero's journey. I've decided on the first 12 books that I'm going to write. And my underlying subplot is going to be about a detective that's chasing all of these serial killers. So what I've done is each book contains one beat for him of his hero's journey. So initially, we're introduced to his ordinary world. He's a detective that chases serial killers. That's really all we find out about the detective in Meet Cute. He doesn't actually catch them in that particular book. They end up getting away. That's their happily ever after, keeping it in that happy romance genre. Okay, but then as he goes along in the Call of Adventure, he discovers there's a group of killers. In the next one, he's injured and forced to retire. In the next one, he comes back as a private investigator with a new partner. Okay. And we've walked him through these things, but only one of these things happens to him each book. So if people are following carefully the detective's sub story through all of the books, that's going to tie this series neatly together. But the rest of them are all just kind of standalone things. And it doesn't really matter if the reader knows these background things. It kind of adds a neat depth to things, but it doesn't change the story at all. So you can have something like that too, that's a B story that runs through all of your stories, but that's not necessarily the main plot, because that enables you to leave things to stand alone better. There's also, you could do this any number of ways. You could have one of the beats of the detective cover two different books, or you could have two of the beats happen to him in a single book, whatever you want. The idea is that you're developing a story structure, whatever story structure that you use outside of your individual books, to help you organize the entire series and make sure the series itself tells a cohesive story. Okay, so these are just a couple of the different ways you can do that. Then when I get down to the nitty gritty and these particular things, I've showed these before in webinars and stuff like that, but I've got a romancing the beat kind of a plot set up for each of the stories in the book. And these things are all, I can just weave in the detective's plot line in with these things that are happening to the couple. And it makes it very simple to have that continuum going through the series, tie it all together, but still keep the couples separate in that particular case. Okay. The other thing that I want to show you really quick with this is that you also can tie in all your characters. So, of course, one of the things that I wanted first when Plottr was first developing was a series Bible. And so we've obviously taken that to another level with the series Bible than what it was before, with all the tagging options and all the things like that that we have. So what I've done in this as well is, you notice when I click into these that I have started to tag some of the characters in these particular things. So I've started to, let me go back to my series view real quick here. I've started to add in characters that are going to be involved in each of these sections of the book. And as I go forward, if you look at my characters, I've tagged them all with different roles and different books that they're going to be involved in. So Jack, of course, my main character, is going to be involved in all of them, but there's some people that are only going to be involved in the first couple. Some of them won't be involved in hardly at all. They're just very minor characters, that type of thing. Okay. So I've used this ability to tag them not only in the individual books timelines, but in the series timeline as well. And then if I'm coming through here and I say, well, I only want to look at books at people that are going to be in the Jack of Spades, I just filter my characters that way. And I'm looking at this, even if I'm looking at this timeline view, and I know that those people only appear in this early first book. Okay. So it's just a way for you to organize and keep track of your series in a neater, kind of more cohesive way, where you can look at everything at once, all in one spot. Now, the beauty of this too is that you can export this the same as you can export your regular your regular timelines. So you could export this series timeline, let's say to Word or Scrivener, wherever you want. I would probably do it to Word. You can export it there, have all your headings, and you can have all your series notes also in a Word document, depending upon how your process works. I usually have Plottr open one window, Scrivener open another. But if you don't want to do that, or if you work in Word or something like that, you can export this timeline, excuse me, the same way you could any other timeline, and basically use it to keep track of your series as you're going through the writing process. Now, as I'm going through the writing process, I also come back into this file and I change it. So if I change direction as I'm writing along and the first book doesn't end exactly the way that I had planned, which is unlikely in this case, but sometimes in other books it happens, then I come in and I actually change my Plottr file. Not only the individual book Plottr, but the series Plottr file too, the series template as well, so that I know where I've come and where I'm going and how much that affects the next book. And that helps you speed up your process of writing the series, because as you go from book to book, you already know what that transition is going to be. You already know what the general story of the next book is going to be. And it makes that writing process faster and smoother. You can get on with the next book and send this one off to your editor to be looked at and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So, so yes, while you were killing needs to be in there. Yes, that's very true. All right. So this is just one of the ways that you can look at to basically, or two of the ways that you can look at to set up a series story arc. You don't have to use a template, but the templates are very, very useful in making sure that your overall story is on track, that the timing is correct, and that you're hitting all the points that your readers are really going to love. I hope this has been helpful for you. And with that, thanks everybody for joining me for another Thursdays with Troy. We'll see you next time. Thanks everybody. Bye.